Well, yesterday, Mrs. Owen drove me to a meeting. And as she drove, I realized something about me. When I'm a passenger in a car, I just want to go to sleep. I don't know, it's just one of those things. I just feel I could just nod off. I'm quite happy to do that. And when we've shared the driving on different trips we've been on, I've gone to sleep in the passenger seat, and that's just it. I don't know whether you're like that, or whether you're there with a fear of God in you if somebody else is driving. Some of you are looking at your spouses now, but I'm quite happy. I'm quite happy just to fall asleep. I'll wake up and we've gone miles. Well, it's fine. I used to do these mission trips into Eastern Europe and stuff, and you literally had to grab sleep when you could, and you'd be in a different country when you woke up. It was amazing. And I'm just one of those people, I guess. I was moving, but I had no idea, and I could just nod off. And I was thinking about that, and the fact is, there are lots of times when we're moving and we don't notice. So, for instance, I'm sure you know this already, don't you? But we are moving now. We are actually moving. We're moving incredibly fast. You're actually traveling right now. Tony, I think I've got this right, 67,000 miles an hour, roughly. Depends on your frame of reference. Google is my frame of reference. But we are moving. Now, I don't know about you, just a minute. Can you sense it? We're not aware of it, but we are moving. That's the speed that the Earth apparently orbits the Earth. And on top of that, of course, Earth itself is rotating. At the equator, have I got this right? It's about 1,000 miles per hour. Ah, there you go. I've taught you something. There you go. But we don't feel it. We don't feel that we're on the move. We don't think about it because we don't feel it. Why don't we feel it? Well, there is a scientific term called "I have no idea, go ask a physicist." I am like, but we don't feel it. We're moving right now, but we are unaware of it. We don't sense it. We don't feel it. We don't recognize it. There are times that life is moving, but we just don't see it. And oftentimes, I think that perfectly describes our relationship with God. Because if we were honest about it, God is always moving and working, but for lots of different reasons, we don't always recognize it. We don't always sense it. We don't always feel it. But just because we don't recognize it or we don't feel it, of course, that doesn't mean he's not moving. He is. He's working. So this morning, I want to look with you at how God moved through his people. And we're going to look at the book of Exodus. They didn't always recognize it themselves, but I'm hopeful that through this process, we'll discover that God is moving in and through us, and in and through our church, whether we recognize it or not. So I'm really grateful to Sally Ann for having read that chapter 1 of Exodus. And if you've got a Bible with you, or you've got a Bible app on your phone or whatever, get it out, open it up to Exodus chapter 1. We're not going to be able to cover the whole book of Exodus, let alone the whole of the chapter, but I want to challenge you, read it. Read the book of Exodus this week. This morning we're going to see the role that fear plays in moving with God. The role that fear plays in moving with God, in our relationship with God. Now, I know now I am treading on territory that Pastor Tim really, really loves and just spends so much time in the book of Exodus and in the whole Exodus account. So forgive me, brother, but while you were away, the cat did play. So let's come into Exodus. Got it open in your Bibles? Got it open on your phone? Okay, so we're going to go to chapter 1 and verse 1. These are the names of the sons of Israel who went to Egypt with Jacob, each with his family. Got Reuben, Simeon, Levi and Judah, Issachar, Zebulun and Benjamin, Dan and Naphtali, Gad and Asher. I have suggested these names to Kate, who's about to give birth to a boy. She's not that interested, but there we go. I think Naphtali Jones would be quite nice. The descendants of Jacob numbered 70 in all. Joseph was already in Egypt. Now, this is going back a bit, really, to what happens in the book of Genesis. To give you the context, it's Genesis chapter 37, right through to chapter 50. Now, we don't have time to go over all of that. It's a great story. If you're not familiar with it, again, I'd encourage you to read it. Let me just sum it up for you. There's a Hebrew guy called Joseph. He's a foreigner in the land of Egypt, and he ends up as second in command over all of Egypt. And he brought his whole family, he had 11 brothers, to be with him. I don't know what that was like. Can you imagine having 11 brothers and sisters? I know some of you are from large families, but fighting over the last packet of Quavers, or let alone trying to go to the toilet, blinking heck, you can just imagine. Yikes, it must have been terrible. But now the family had relocated to Egypt, and we're told there in that passage there's about 70 of them. Hold on to that. God had already taken them on a big move to get them to where they were, and they were very thankful for it, because there was a famine, if you remember, back in the region that they had come from. There was no food, and so they'd moved. God had brought them to Egypt, where they could be taken care of through the auspices of their brother Joseph. That move was a huge thing. That move was a huge blessing to them. And then we go on in chapter 1 to verses 6 and 7. We read that Joseph and his brothers lived out the rest of their lives in Egypt. Joseph and all his brothers and all that generation died. But the Israelites were exceedingly fruitful. They multiplied greatly. Now, this isn't about mathematics. This is about begatting. All right? This is about a family growing. And they multiplied greatly. They increased in numbers and became so numerous that the land was filled with them. So eventually, as we see, Joseph's generation died out. A new generation followed. They settled down. They started having kids. Apparently, they didn't stop having kids. They had a lot of kids. We don't get an actual number at this point. But if you read on in Exodus to chapter 12, we're told there that there was something like 600,000 Israelite men. And that's just the guys who were fit and healthy and could fight. It didn't include all the men, and it didn't include women and children. So as you can see, we're talking about multiplication. We're talking about a lot of begatting. We're talking about a lot of, yes, there we are. So they have families. That's what they do. This is all perfectly natural. And the nation of Israel is growing. The people group of Israel is growing. They're in Egypt. Some scholars suggest that there's potentially over 2 million of them by the time we're talking about. But whatever the actual number, there's a lot of them. So things are going well for the Israelites, aren't they? God had moved them to a good land. They're having food in their bellies. They've got a good home. They're growing in number. It seems like God is doing some great things for them. But then we come to verse 8, and we read this. A new king, to whom Joseph meant nothing, came to power in Egypt. Look, he said to his people, the Israelites have become far too numerous for us. Come, we must deal shrewdly with them, or they will become even more numerous. And if war breaks out, we'll join our enemies, fight against us, and leave the country. So they put slave masters over them to oppress them with forced labor. And they built Pithom and Ramesses as store cities for Pharaoh. But the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied and spread. So the Egyptians came to dread the Israelites and worked them ruthlessly. So you see what's happening now. A new king has come into power. Crucially, we're told, he didn't have a clue about their history. He didn't have a Scooby-Doo about Joseph and these Israelites and how they came to be in the land and everything. He didn't know the blessing that Joseph had been to the former Pharaoh and to all of Israel when he was second in command. Indeed, the new king's reaction to these Israelite people is one of fear. He is scared stiff that this little people group, not so little anymore, could rise up and usurp his power, his authority. He is scared. He is fearful. And that's the thing, isn't it? When you are scared of something, when you are fearful of something or someone, that's a very powerful thing. And some of you sat here this morning or listening online know exactly what I mean, because you are fearful of somebody. There is somebody in your group of friends or even in your family that you are scared of. The last thing you want to do is upset them. You live with that dread. Many of us know exactly what that is like. This guy is terrified of the Israelites, the potential of what they could do. They could cause him great trouble. He was worried sick that they would lead to him losing power and authority. So he reacts. He reacts out of fear towards them. And the result of the fear was that he enslaved the Israelites and he forces them into forced labor. He works the people so hard. They build cities for him, but his fear caused him to treat them ruthlessly. Do you see that? You see that in the text? That's what's happening. He's scared stiff of these people because it might remove his power, challenge his authority. And that brings me to a very, very important point this morning. If we are going to move forward in our relationship with God, we need to remember not to act in fear towards people. Some of us are held back in our relationship with God, in our walk with him, because we're frightened, we're scared of what other people will think. We're worried that people will think that we're religious nutcases. That somehow, when the conversation around the water cooler tomorrow goes to, what did you do over the weekend? We'll spend far more time talking about what we did Saturday than mention we went to church on Sunday morning. There is a fear in a lot of us about coming out, about who we are as people of faith. But we can't live like that. We can't let fear be the determining factor in how we interrelate with people and get on with our lives. The Israelites were a group of people who needed help. The previous Pharaoh had stepped up and had helped them through Joseph. But now this new Pharaoh, remember critically, he didn't know them. Didn't have a clue. He was afraid of them. And his fear was based on ignorance. Ignorance about this people group and their story. And so this is a vital lesson for us to take on board as Christians in the 21st century. We cannot interact or not interact with people based on fear. The world has changed. There are a lot of people who are very different from you and me living in Risca, living in Cross Keys, living in Wattsville, living in Rogie, living in Wales, living in the UK, living in the world. We live in a global village. We come across people now whose ethnicity is different from ours, whose language, whose culture, whose background, whose customs, everything so different from anything maybe our forefathers experienced. And many of us are afraid. And there's a challenge here to us not to be afraid. We can't move forward with God if we are fearful. I remember the first year I went to Belarus on a mission trip. Belarus was an interesting place back then. It's been in the news recently again, of course, because of its associations with Russia and what it's doing to the people of Ukraine. I went on a mission trip to Belarus, and the people there on the first day, I remember distinctly, they were very standoffish with us. Now, apparently, previous groups of Brits and Americans had come in and had not treated them very well. Kind of, we're here, we know what we're doing, you listen to us, you respond accordingly. They hadn't treated them with love, hadn't treated them with respect. So, understandably, what did our hosts do? They acted in fear towards us. They were fearful of what these Westerners were here to do. It wasn't based on knowledge of us. I mean, I'm a lovely boy. I'm a Swansea Jack. I don't live to offend anybody. I try to do my best. I'm all right, Jane, aren't I? You know. So, it really hurt me. Because I could see the fear in them. And the lovely thing is, over the next few days, we sat and we talked and we prayed and we shared meals together. And gradually, you could see them changing. And they realized that we weren't there to do anything to them. We were there to encourage them and help them and learn from them indeed. But more importantly, share the gospel with them. And thankfully, it didn't take very long for them to change their minds and become very open and very welcoming of us, and we went back there again. But to do that, they had to not act in fear towards us. I think some people out there are frightened of us. I think some people out there think that you and I think we are better than them. I think a lot of people that we meet in our workplaces or socially may well think that we have an opinion that we are one step ahead, that we are better, that we are holier. Jesus' followers shouldn't treat people based on fear. We need to recognize that people are vulnerable. And there's a lot of need and a lot of concern. I made an appeal over this weekend for the Risk of Food Bank. When you think of the people who are having to access that, for many of them, I've talked to some of them, they are embarrassed that they have to access that. I don't want them to feel embarrassed. I want to be able to share my food with them. I want to be able to put something in the Aldi collection point. Because it's important that they understand, I'm not judging anybody. We're sisters and brothers created in the image of God. We're equal. It's just that they have a particular need at a particular time. We shouldn't be fearful. We live in a world that is full of fear. We live in a world that is full of bias towards people and people groups. When I read the New Testament, I see that God stands against racism, ageism, sexism, and discrimination in all forms. He calls us, doesn't he, to love people and treat them in love, not to be fearful of them, because he loves them. There's no caveat in John 3:16, is there? It's God so loved the world, except, no bracket, except so-and-so, so-and-so, so. He so loved the world, he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever, apart from, whosoever believes in him should not perish but have everlasting life. Don't be afraid of the neighbour who's different from you. You all have neighbours like that, don't we? You have people living on your street. I've got them in mine. Work colleagues. My gosh. I've got a work colleague who's really different from me. What about the latest boyfriend your daughter brings home? I mean, nobody's ever good enough to take away your little girl. But sometimes we're so fearful that it creates problems. We need to engage with people. Don't be afraid. To love people. It's okay. And when we do that, yeah, okay, it leaves us open to the possibility of being hurt. Yes, it does. Of course it does. And I've been hurt a lot, as I'm sure you have. But okay, part of being obedient to the call to go and proclaim the gospel in all its fullness. We see this with the disciples in the book of Acts. They were constantly going into areas and situations where they knew they could get in trouble or even get hurt. Look at Paul. Look at the things he endured. Blinking heck. Still went. Still proclaimed the gospel. We have to be willing to engage with people, even if it leaves us vulnerable. We have to share the good news of Jesus. If we shut ourselves away because of fear, oh yeah, we're going to be safe, we're going to be protected, but we're going to lose the ability to engage and develop relationships. I mean, I love this place, but blinking heck, we need to get out. We need to share the love of Jesus with people. People who are different from us, who don't look like us, talk like us, dress like us, or whatever. We can't act in fear towards people. That's exactly what Pharaoh was doing. We see it starkly in this passage. He's fearful. And so he enslaves the Israelites. But did you catch? Even during their mistreatment, God was with them. Verse 12 said, the more they were oppressed by the Egyptians, the more they multiplied and spread. God was moving because God was with them. God was in relationship with them, even though they were going through difficulty. And if we're going through difficulty, it's okay, God's with us. And that led Pharaoh to even more extreme action. And that's what we can expect. You know, you look at what's happening in our world, this is exactly what we see, isn't it? And so you come to verse 15. Where are we here? I've lost my place. Here we are. The king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, those whose names were Shiphrah, is that right? And Puah. When you are helping the Hebrew women during childbirth on the delivery stool, if you see that the baby is a boy, kill him. But if it's a girl, let her live. That's terrible, isn't it? Do you know there are parts of the world where that still happens? There's tremendous persecution in our world. And misogyny means that very often, you know, people act in the opposite way to that. If it's a girl, worthless. Seen that in some nations? Pharaoh wanted to stop the Israelites from multiplying. Cunning plan, wasn't it? Told the Hebrew midwives, the women who assisted when a child was born, kill the males. We see this replicated again later on when Jesus is born, isn't it? Herod says the same. Kill the boys. It's horrific. It's heartbreaking. It's the kind of thing that results when we let fear rule our decisions. Because fear of people leads to destructive decisions. That's the reality. You've probably seen it in your own life, and I've seen it in mine. I've done some pretty shameful things because I was frightened of what people might say or think. Pharaoh let his fear of the Israelites and fear of losing his power lead him to make awful, horrific decisions that abused a whole race of people. Something, of course, that was replicated with the Third Reich. You think about the Second World War. Some of you here lived through that. You know that this is a reality. And in other parts of the world it's happening. We can see similar examples throughout history. We know that in our lives, fear can lead us to make quite rash decisions that are harmful to us and to those around us. To quote great wisdom of the past, fear is the path to the dark side. Fear leads to anger, and anger leads to hate. Hate leads to suffering. Very wise words from Yoda. But there's truth in them. See, sometimes stuff gets said as a throwaway in a film. Actually, actually, there's a lot of truth. Fear led Pharaoh to make decisions in anger and out of hatred towards the Israelites, and it led to great suffering for those people. When we let fear be the determining factor in our decision making, we do whatever it takes to protect ourselves. Pharaoh's fear led him to enslave a massive group of people, attempt to kill a whole generation of baby boys. Making decisions based on fear leads to illogical, irrational, dangerous decision making. And when we fear people, it leads us to push them away, turn our hearts from them, leads us not to trust them. It builds and builds and builds itself to where before too long we treat people harshly. And actually we are showing hatred towards them. That's not the gospel, is it? It's not the gospel. But please don't misunderstand me here. I'm not telling you not to fear anything. And in this passage, it's beautifully captured. Because the midwives understood that. They knew what to fear. And it informed their reaction to Pharaoh's horrific request. Read about that in verse 17. The midwives, however, what does it say? Feared God and did not do what the king of Egypt had told them to do. They let the boys live. Then the king of Egypt summoned the midwives and asked them, "Why have you done this? Why have you let the boys live?" The midwives answered Pharaoh, "Hebrew women are not like Egyptian women. They're vigorous and give birth before the midwives arrive." I love that. I love that. Oh, it's a baby. Never mind. So God was kind to the midwives, and the people increased and became even more numerous. And because the midwives feared God, he gave them families of their own. And Pharaoh gave this order to all his people now, not the midwives, his people. Every Hebrew boy that is born, you must throw him into the Nile. Let every girl live. I love those midwives. I love their example. You see the most important truth about fear? We should fear God. Now, the fear that we're talking about here is about having a healthy respect and understanding of who God really is, as opposed to a kind of fear where you cower in the corner. You know, God's not calling us to come in here, like this on a Sunday, Did you ever do that? The church I grew up in made you think that that's the way you should come to worship. Because you were a miserable sinner, who the heck did you think you were to dare to come in through the doors of a chapel? Still get it now, I talk to people and maybe they're a bit potty-mouthed or something and they go, oh, look where I am. And building. God doesn't live here. God abides with us wherever we are. But we need to have a healthy respect and an understanding of who God really is, not so that we cower, but rather that we recognize who he is and are just amazed. I am amazed that this God who we worship and praise and honor and adore loves me. Because if you knew me, you'd spit in my face. But he loves me, and he loves you. And you've mucked up, and you've done stuff that you shouldn't have done, and he still loves you. Whee! How awesome is that, eh? But I need to respect who he is. I need to understand he is God, full of splendor and power and holiness and majesty. It's realizing who I am. I'm not worthy to stand in his presence, but because of his graciousness, he allows me to come and just be in his presence and enjoy a relationship with him. Thank you, thank you, thank you. The midwives feared God. They knew that however powerful Pharaoh was, he wasn't God. The rest of Egypt believed that Pharaoh was God, but the midwives knew the truth. They knew there was only one God, and they feared him. They understood who God was, and it led them to fear God and stand with him, even though it meant standing against Pharaoh. Nonconformists have a oh, the ice cream man. There we go. Thank you. Dear me. They understood God. They understood who he was. We are good nonconformists. You know, nonconformists have a tradition of not conforming. Hence the name nonconformist. I want to say to you, as a Christian and as a Baptist, I am wanting to rediscover in my relationship with God a godly determination to stand against the injustices of this world. Because one day everybody will give an account to him, including myself, and I really feel that Christians need to take seriously again, if they are fearful of God, if they recognize who God really is, we need to stand up and be counted. We need to stand up against some of the injustices that are going on in our nation. We need to speak out against our government. We need to speak out in our employment situations. We need to speak out in our families. Christians are called, surely, not to conform and be squeezed into the image of the world and just there, you just stay in your little chapel and you'll be fine. We are called, surely, to make a difference, to be salt and light. Pharaoh had the power to have the midwives killed on the spot, but these midwives understood the reality that Jesus actually would talk about thousands of years later. In Matthew chapter 10, he says, don't be afraid of those who kill the body, but cannot kill the soul. Rather be afraid of the one who can destroy both soul and body in hell. We are called, aren't we, to speak up on behalf of the disadvantaged and the marginalized. We are called, aren't we, to address certain issues. Jesus told his disciples this thing when he was preparing to face incredible persecution. And he knew that following him would lead them into persecution. But God is supreme. God is infinitely more powerful than a human. The most powerful human to ever live is still nothing in comparison to the power of God. Let me hear an amen to that. Well, is that the problem, you see? We've put God in his nice little box, and we have no understanding of how supreme and majestic and holy and powerful he actually is. I'd rather be with him in the midst of persecution than standing against him in comfort. And I don't know where you stand on this, but I'll say this. For me, as I read Scripture and as I look at the world, I see that we are moving towards the end of the end times. And I think we as Christians will be called upon to either cower away in the safety of our chapels or come out and stand and make a stand. Pharaoh's fear was undeterred. He turned to the Egyptians, not the midwives. He told them to throw every boy into the river because fear continued to control him. So here's ultimately what I want to say as we begin to close this morning. In order to move with God and recognize his activity in our lives, we've got to have a godly reverence and holy fear of him. Do we revere God? Where is our fear? Do we fear people? Are we afraid what they'll think of us? Do we act in fear towards our neighbor, our colleagues, towards a certain group of people? towards someone at school or college or university? Do we keep them at arm's length because we're afraid of them? Or are we sharing Jesus with them and wanting to embrace them in love, to share the good news? When we fear God, when we have a healthy respect and understanding of who he really is, when we recognize his power and supremacy and might and love, when we do that, we have no reason to fear anybody. We stand on the side of the Almighty. Does that leave you to being open to being hurt? Absolutely. Yes, it does. But does it also leave you open to being able to experience and give love to people who desperately need it? You bet. And it allows you to see God moving in your life and through you into the lives of other people. So I'm going to pause as we finish this morning. And in the silence of these moments, I want to ask you honestly a question. Do you fear people more than God? Is that something you need to sort out with him this morning? You can see this simple prayer on the screen, because I'm pretty sure all of us can think of somebody that we're afraid of. And maybe in the quietness of our own hearts, I'm not going to ask you to pray this out loud, but just in the quietness of your own heart, you'll fill in the blank. God, forgive me for acting fear towards. Turn my heart to love and not fear them. Maybe it's a work colleague. Maybe it's somebody in your family. Someone in your friendship group. Turn your heart to love. Don't fear them. You may also want to pray this. God, show me how to reverence you. To have a holy fear of you. Show me who you are. Reveal yourself to me so that I can stand in awe of you and fear you. God is moving in our world, and we need to be bold. We don't need to cower away. We need an audacity in the gospel to be able to stand up and be counted. And the first step is to make sure that we're moving with God, that we're rightly fearing him, not people. And then we'll see some incredible things. Let's take a moment. You may want to look at this prayer or these prayers on the screen and use them. Just to take a moment in quiet. Make these prayers yours, personally, quietly. Name those things that you need to sort out. Let's do that in quiet.